Hi, this is Ken and Michelle Bass.
And you're listening to the Resilient Parenting Podcast.
Well, here we are once again. Where are we anyway?
We are sitting at our dining room table, and currently the cat is on top of the table, which is a no-no, but you know what? He's not currently eating the microphone, so I'm not going to even do anything. So
Okay.
Sit away. You're cute.
Yeah, he is cute. You're cute too.
Oh, wait. Thanks.
Yeah.
You said the cat was cute, and that reminded you of me?
We'll just end this conversation there because we have somebody we're going to be talking to here in just a minute or so.
Okay.
You know?
That's a very strange segue. We went from cat to Michelle, now to the guest. You
This
sound
is
like you need a nap.
I do need a nap. Speaking of which,
Well,
yeah, we'll discuss such sleep in general in just a few.
don't fall asleep. So, hello, we're joined by Sean Larsen from British Columbia. That's very exciting. We'll go into how we know Sean, but first let's learn a little bit about Sean. So, Sean Larsen has a PhD in counseling psychology with a dissertation on masculinity in the transition to fatherhood and a master's looking at fatherhood in the military. Sean has spoken nationally and internationally on anxiety, intense behaviors, suicide, and sleep. He has been a practitioner for over 15 years with children and families, and we are so excited to have you here with us today. Thank you for
having
joining.
me.
It's our pleasure.
So before we get into what we're going to talk about today, how did we meet Sean?
Oh, we met. See, if you can see the sweatshirt I'm wearing now, which you can't see on the podcast, but I'm wearing my Oregon Coast sweatshirt, just in your honor, Sean.
Thank you.
We met in Yachats, Oregon, on the coast.
Probably,
Remember-
like midway, right? Between Walport and Yachats, I think.
Yeah, somewhere where we were staying. Yeah,
Yeah.
right there on the coast, and you were there with your family, and we were there with ours, and you were in the cabin next to ours, I think, right?
Right next to us. And then our kids met and they basically befriended each other. And then our families befriended each other on that trip. It was so cool.
Yeah.
And I remember us going, why are you here? You have all that beautiful, it's like, it was your adventure. It's awesome.
We used to drive down that Oregon coast every year.
We try to go every year.
Yeah, when we can. Yeah.
When we can, for sure. It's been 10 years, and our kids have gotten a lot bigger and older, but Ken was just mentioning you can't see, well, you'll see in the picture, but he doesn't look any different from 10 years ago. So we're a little jealous, but.
Sean doesn't look any different. I do.
Oh, yeah. Was talking about Sean. Sorry.
Well, we've been doing a lot of parenting in the last 10 years, huh?
Yeah. My hair's completely silver now.
I feel a lot different. I don't remember at those ages having to stretch like a cat every time I got out of bed, but nowadays I feel.
Yeah. I get injured in my sleep.
Yeah.
I don't know how that works.
I plead the fifth.
So we're going to talk today about sleep. Now, I have to say, Sean, we haven't talked about this, and I'm totally putting you on the spot, but no pressure. After reading your whole introduction, I would love to have you come back on and talk about fatherhood, being a father and masculinity and all that. But that, you think about it. Let's see how it goes, and if you still like us after this.
Another day, another time. Yeah.
So tell us what you have to share about sleep.
So I guess the background of it is that I've worked with children and families for years, and I suppose it was somewhat accidental, my interest in sleep, but not really, just because I think sleep is so foundational to everything. And I know in the years of work I've done with kids that just over time, it just became one of the first things I started asking about. Because if you were like a really malicious person and you were like, hey, how can we create a mental health problem in anyone, not just a child, but especially in children, it's really simple. All you'd have to do is stop them from sleeping for 2 days. If you stopped a kid from sleeping for 48 hours, there's a lot of research out there that would show that they'd show up clinical on a lot of screens for mental health, which then if you flip it the other way, is certainly what I found, which is if we can support kids to sleep better, it doesn't always get rid of the mental health problem, but it
Mhm.
certainly gives us a better baseline to work from. And then a lot of the risks that you have with mental health, because one of my other areas that I've focused on in work is like suicide risk prevention, which is such a
Mhm.
heavy topic, but I know that sleep has become a huge discussion in the area of suicide risk assessment and suicide prevention, because we know that somebody's risk of death by suicide goes up dramatically if they haven't slept, especially in the acute term before a
Mhm.
suicidal event. And so, like when we're safety planning with kids, that's always for me, one of the first things that I'm checking in on or supervising people on is, have you asked about sleep, and can we get this person's sleep on track as soon as possible,
Yeah.
which is so hard in childhood.
Do you think there's a the whole electronic world and having your phone by you, do you think that has a negative impact on sleep?
Oh yeah, we can. Do we want to get into some sleep theory? Because
Yeah.
I think there's a huge discussion out there about how digital media impacts sleep, and I'm going to argue that it does impact sleep in the ways that are talked about, but I'm also going to argue that it impacts sleep more in some other ways too that maybe don't get talked about quite as much.
Well, let's get into it. Let's
Argue
do
away.
it.
Go ahead.
I love it.
Okay. So I think, yeah, so that discussion I think goes into how people fall asleep, right?
Hmm.
That's like how are people falling asleep? And when we talk about how people fall asleep, there's three things I think that are really at the core of how people fall asleep, and that's circadian rhythms is the first one. The second is sleep pressure, and then the third is arousal. And circadian rhythms, I think, is one that, without knowing about it, like a lot of people actually know a fair bit about. This is where the blue light discussion comes in. But a circadian rhythm essentially is every 24 hours your brain fires uh, at the same time. It's this internal clock, and the mechanism that the brain uses to do that is melatonin, which a lot of people have heard about because
Hmm.
over-the-counter melatonin is hugely popular. But about the same time every day, yeah, it's a really interesting discussion that I try not to get that much into, but it makes a lot of sense why it's so helpful for people, because at about the same time every day, your melatonin levels start rising, and then it reaches a point that helps you get to sleep. And everybody's
Oh.
clock is a little bit different.
Hmm.
And so, like across the world, it's like split into thirds, where we've got early sleepers, mid sleepers. Like it's called a chronotype, and there's an early chronotype, a mid chronotype, and a late chronotype, which makes a lot of sense when you consider, we've had the same brains for like 125,000 years or more. Um,
Mhm.
and across that, like a lot of our situations in which we're sleeping maybe weren't as safe as they currently are. And so you
Mm.
kind of need people up throughout the night doing different things, whether it's tending the fire, looking out, or whatever. And so it makes a lot of sense evolutionarily because it's a huge stress. But where I think melatonin's interesting in this discussion is that when you think of melatonin starting to rise, that looks different depending on your chronotype. And so for somebody like me, I've always had a very late chronotype. Like if you just left me to sleep whenever my brain wanted to sleep, um, I'd probably be falling asleep after midnight on every night.
Oh,
And
wow.
between midnight and one, like I'm incredibly late. And as a teenager, and we can talk about this because chronotypes are interesting in teenage years too, because across all cultures, there's about a 2 hour lag in
Mhm.
where your circadian rhythm sits. And that's why you see from about the ages of like 14 to like your early 20s, uh,
Hmm.
people love the nightlife and love to bookie, so to speak. Um, but for like most kids, like going to high school, like if you have an early or mid chronotype, like if your bedtime's like 9:30,
Hmm.
then a 2 hour lag isn't going to be that devastating. It's still going to let you get like 7 or 8 hours of sleep, which isn't quite enough, but it's enough compared to what a lot of kids are getting. But if you think of somebody like me in my teenage years, um, that 2 hour lag set me
Hmm.
up for really struggling to get to school and to be able
Oh,
to focus,
right.
because it was very hard for me to fall asleep. And I didn't know much about sleep hygiene because that's really been my answer, and it's never been that easy. But for me to function like a normal adult, like I have to maintain a very regular bedtime to
Hmm.
kind of trick my chronotype into keeping it steady. Because if I stay up really late for a couple nights in a row or whatever, my brain will just be like, "Oh yeah, this is where we want it at."
Now, as far as teens go, um, teens that we've known in our life like to sleep more than 8 hours, maybe go like from 10 p.m. all the way up till noon the next day. Is that the change in circadian rhythms, or what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think they need so much sleep, and they build, what people refer to as a sleep debt. And so you see on the weekends that like huge sleep in pattern, but sadly the research is like resoundingly clear. And there's a number of massive, especially in the States where you are, research projects looking at how much sleep teens are getting, and it's staggering um, how little sleep teenagers are getting compared to how
Mm-hmm.
much they need. And that ties in when you talk about like that becomes really scary when you look at what's actually happening in sleep. But anyways, so the falling asleep. So the first bit is circadian rhythms, which is
Mm-hmm.
related to melatonin, and this is where the discussion of like blue light comes in, because those circadian rhythms, you can reset those, or you can adapt them or change them or influence them based on like light and temperature.
I'm unfamiliar with the blue light.
I think it's just a spectrum of light that is I think is more influential in shifting your sleep rhythm, because there is research showing that if certain spectrums of light closer to
Mm-hmm.
bedtime are kind of going to trick the brain, because again our brain's been around for so long that it just got into this pattern of being like, oh, guess what? There's no more light. We should probably go to sleep, because what else are
Oh,
we going to
right.
do? Whereas if you're
Okay.
flashing these interior lights, your brain's like, oh, maybe we don't need to release quite as much because it seems like it's still light. I don't know what's going on here,
Right. Okay,
kind of
that makes
deal.
sense. That makes sense.
Yeah, and then more recently too, actually, temperature has become a big discussion related to circadian rhythms, and that again, if you go back in time to where we were probably sleeping for most of the period in which we've had this brains, like you'd be around a campfire and it'd get dark and it would get colder, and so your body's used to a slight drop in temperature too. And this is tough because a lot of people love going to bed like feeling cozy and warm, but it's actually
Mm-hmm.
not as good for a good quality sleep throughout the whole night for it to be warm,
So,
like too
okay.
warm.
So that makes sense because if it's too warm, I have trouble sleeping. We have a fan going. I don't care if it's winter. We have a fan going. I think I always have at least one leg out of the bed, and I think we have the window open. Like our poor heater and air conditioner doesn't know what to do with us, but that makes sense why we do that. And I sleep better when I'm cooler. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and if you watch like any kid, like, and especially like raising kids and little kids, like when you
Mhm.
put a little kid to bed, like you snug them into their blankets, and post like first like influenza and that like 50s 60s, there was this huge fear of like, oh, kids can't get colder, they'll get sick, and we still like carry a lot of that. We're like, man, we've really got to tuck this kid in to take care of
Mm-hmm.
them, and then you walk back into the room like a few minutes later and there's like a starfish, which is just like, it's the easiest way that the body's thermoregulating. Like to throw a foot out of the blanket helps you cool your body down, and that's exactly why they're doing it. So yeah, that ideal sleep temperature is like 18 and a half degrees, so a fair bit colder than a lot of people keep their
All right.
rooms, which is like, if you're thinking of how do you help a kid get a really good night's sleep, making
Mm-hmm.
sure that they have options, so to speak,
Okay.
related to temperature is good. So not having the base temperature of the room too high, and then also like, some of those like closed foot like snuggies or like sleep things
Mm.
that kids wear, like those can be a lot harder for them to regulate if they do get uncomfortable and could impact
Oh,
their,
yeah. Okay,
True.
that makes sense.
yeah. But we still carry like so much fear of like children cannot get cold, and all
Yes,
So
that
I,
so
came out
true.
of, yeah.
I shouldn't go to bed in my footy pajamas anymore. Know what you're saying?
For so many reasons,
Yeah.
Ken.
I think do whatever floats your boat. If you're noticing it's a problem,
What about
maybe
my
that's something you can
boat?
adjust. Yeah.
My boat. Think of my boat.
So much for the nightlife and boogieing, I
Yeah.
guess. Huh?
So that's circadian rhythms, and that ties into the question that um, started this all off about
Mm-hmm.
digital media, cell phones, and how that's impacting sleep. And then really quickly, but really importantly, the second, because this is going to tie into teenage life too, but the second thing that's really important for sleep is something called sleep pressure, which is that every moment you're awake and as you're
Mm-hmm.
burning energy, something called adenosine is being produced as a byproduct. And throughout the day, that adenosine builds up and kind of reaches a tipping point. And that's when you start like yawning and your eyes start feeling like you can't keep them open anymore. That's
Mm-hmm.
called
Mm-hmm.
sleep pressure. And
Oh,
sleep pressure is interesting because this is what ties into the discussion on naps. This is what ties in especially to people love a chemical that is an adenosine blocker. That's literally what it does, is it blocks the effect of adenosine, and that's caffeine, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what caffeine is doing. But sleep pressure
okay.
is a really good one to talk about because one, the caffeine, which we know that kids are consuming more of these days, and
Yeah.
some of those
Hmm.
energy drinks, I don't know why kids need energy drinks to play video games, but they seem like they feel they want to. And some of those have like 200 or 300 milligrams of caffeine, which is like 2 or 3 times what's in a, a cup of coffee, and the half-life of
Oh,
caffeine is
wow.
like around 7 hours, I think. And
Yeah.
so if you think of somebody having one of these energy drinks at even like 4 or 5, so huge impacts. And then also, if you have a nap during the day, it just drops that sleep pressure right off, which for some people, like for my wife, who has a very early chronotype and a pretty strong like circadian rhythm putting her to sleep, like she could nap all she wants and it won't impact her sleep. Whereas for me, um, my circadian rhythms aren't going to be much help typically getting me to bed. I need to really dig into my other routines.
Hmm.
And so a nap for me is just disastrous. Like I will not get to sleep if I have a
Right.
nap because it gets rid of all that sleep pressure. It's also like for kids, one of the best, it's a really clear argument for let's keep kids moving and get them outside and get them doing stuff because it builds up adenosine, right? Like if you've had a really active day, those are those days where you sit down and like struggle to keep your eyes open, and that's
Mm-hmm.
from sleep pressure. But
Okay.
this is the one that I wanted to talk about now, is this calming and arousal, because I think this is actually what the biggest catch is with kids and sleep, and digital media, is that teenagers focus on popularity and social evaluation just becomes so strong. Like if I walked into
Right.
a local pub in Roslyn and was hanging out with my friends and I was like, hey, which one of us is most popular? Like, why don't we go around the table and rate each other's popularity? Like, all of my friends would be like, this is why you don't get invited out with us, Sean. But if I asked any teenager over the years who's ever been in my office, like, hey, let's talk about who's most popular in your school, and maybe let's make a list ranking popularity. Teenagers could do it, and they'd probably feel some excitement doing it because it just sits with what's important to them at that area.
Mm.
And if you really step back and look at what a lot of teenagers are doing, like there's this constant social evaluation going on where they're constantly worried about like what's going to bump me up in my social value, and then terrified of things that are going to drop
All
them a
right.
notch or two. And you think of like some of the biggest meltdowns you see in teenage years, it's something that they perceive as bumping them down that social
Right.
hierarchy, whether it's a breakup with friends that's been public online, or people saying stuff online, or something embarrassing getting out. Like these are huge deals to teenagers for that reason, which is, it's important that kids find social value because you don't just want them picking their nose and sleeping through life forever. You want them at some point to be like, geez, I'd like to be valued by this group of humans I'm going to be living with.
Right.
Um, but I think for most teenagers, it just hits them like a Mack truck. This is one of the biggest challenges around sleep time, is that when a kid is scrolling through social media right before bed, it's not just a benign kind of placid, boring thing, and it's way more energized than it might be for an adult. Like it is the social
Oh.
ranking system that's clicking
Mm-hmm.
through their heads, and I think it's, whether it's exciting or scary or whatever it is, it's increasing their arousal, which is the opposite of what we want for sleep, because sleep is a process of disarousal. We want people calming down, and then that's going to help you sleep, because arousal is kind of your body guessing how much energy do I need in the world, and and for sleep you want it to drop pretty low, which is why when we look at really good sleep patterns and things that help people fall asleep and stuff we do with kids, it's usually like starting from something moderately exciting, and then by the time you get to bed, moving to things that would be quote unquote more boring, and
Yeah.
less exciting. I think for teenagers, that's one of the biggest fears and impacts of social media, is that it is so stimulating that it teenagers who already struggle to fall asleep, like if you're on social media right up to bed, it's going to make it even harder to fall asleep. And teenagers have such a hard time anyways. Like the average time it takes teenagers to fall asleep is like half hour to an hour or more, which is so long.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you have a lot of information, but what are some things that folks can do now?
Well, yeah, I think if we're already talking about digital media, I think the advice of, at least an hour before bedtime or sometimes more, depending on your kid, shutting off things that are highly stimulating, especially if kids are struggling to sleep, really good. Basics of sleep hygiene are, yeah, before bed, you want to be doing things that are calming and relaxing. You want to feel safe and comfortable and predictable. This ways that you can do that for kids. Because you're always playing this balancing game of what's best for their sleep and what's going to help them stay calmest, because we know that like the darker the room the better the sleep, but that's hard for kids to fall asleep in sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I'm not opposed to like a door being left open so light can get in, or a night light or something like that while kids are maybe falling asleep. But I think in order to help them get a really good sleep, I think parents can check that they're asleep and then remove those things and make the room darker, and that's going to help them sleep better through the night. And I think reducing the visual area for kids in their bedrooms and tidying up their bedrooms, which is not, that's going to be a hard selling thing, but because again, if you're hyper aroused and nervous going to bed, and if your eyes are constantly guessing at like, what's that thing hanging from the door, and what's that pile of stuff on my dresser that I haven't put away, is that whatever a kid thinks it is, it's going to be harder for them to get to sleep. And so the more predictable and tidy the room is, I've recommended over the years things like little breathable tents that you can put on a bed that will limit the visual sphere for kids who are really nervous at bedtime, or like going to IKEA or something and buying like a trifold or something that you can like fold out at bedtime and can kind of place around the bed to block where kids' eyes can dart. That can help make it a little more comfortable for them to go to sleep too.
Everything that you're talking about that you could do for your kids, I'm also thinking of like the caregivers. A lot of times they do some of the same things, like having their phone on, and they may not have the same, like you were saying, how in teenage years it's all about being seen, but maybe I'm not going to like talk from experience or anything, but maybe they're on a TikTok where the lady comes on and says, I know it's easy to scroll, but you really need to maybe put it down. And I'm like, okay, lady, not that's
happened to you.
No, I mean, I know exactly what she looks like. And as soon as I see her, I just move along. But that, and then a lot of times I know there's parents who like, it's their only time of the day after the kids go to sleep that they can have. So they end up staying up later. And then they don't get enough quality sleep. And so the impact of them being able to, catch things small, and because like you said, sleep is a superpower. And if they're not getting the sleep, it's going to impact their parenting. And so do you have any advice for the caregivers, adults in the family?
Well, yeah, I think across the board, people aren't getting enough sleep. And I would say, and it goes for everyone, is really one of your best tools to help you sleep better is consistency. The more predictable your bedtime routine is, the better. And then again, the more you can move from things that are high stim to low stim. Like I love my Kindle with like the dark back, like the dark lighting. Because that's something I can do in bed, and will usually just kind of start dozing off as I'm reading. It's very calming, but everybody's different in terms of what's stimulating and what's not. Some people just get so wrapped up in their reading that maybe it's not a good idea. I can't listen to podcasts because I just find, I think my brain's trying to pick up on what's being said too much. So it's peaceful for me, but I'm not really getting to sleep. I think for kids, like things like those, like different noise filters that you can get, and there's a lot of apps that can do it now that are just like the white noise or gray noise or whatever color noise is popular right now, or having a fan or something in the room that just kind of masks some of those. Especially for little kids, all the sounds in the house can be so scary, and they don't really have a brain that's great at fact checking. They'll like hear a creak and they'll be like, well, that's clearly a giant spider, and they'll be like, does that sound right, brain? And their brain will be like, yeah, I don't see what else it could be, like, let's go with that.
I do that now.
Yeah, and so things that can kind of mask those small sounds can help kids sleep too. But this is a huge topic. Sorry, I've just flooded you.
No, it's really helpful, and I know that you're going to share with us some of the information that you shared today, but we'll be able to have it in our show notes. Most definitely, thank you so much for sharing this. I sleep is so important, and if you've ever had a newborn, you understand what
Well, lack of sleep can
lack
do to
of sleep can do too.
Oh, the
But you
worst.
don't
Yeah.
have to have that experience to know. And it's interesting to just go back and think about why our brains are made that way, why, for sleep and about the survival and why we need cold and, all of those different things, safety. It's very interesting.
I guess we all need to kind of experiment with what works best for us too to get to this goal, right?
This is true.
With the
Oh,
kids
and
and ourselves.
there's some really easy books I can plug too. There's two books that I just think are brilliant, and one especially, which I've got to say, Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep is a real game-changing book that I'd recommend everyone read.
Why we sleep?
While
Yeah,
we
by
sleep.
Matthew Walker. Why We Sleep by Matthew
Why we
Walker,
sleep.
and
Okay.
then The Sleep Solution by Christopher Winter. Both of them are phenomenal sleep researchers and brilliant.
Awesome.
Very
Thank
good.
you so much for that. And for this conversation. And I know I'm gonna try some things tonight. I'm not gonna feel bad about having the fan. I am doing what nature said I should do.
And I'm going to go take a nap right now.
Perfect.
This podcast is brought to you by the Idaho Children's Trust Fund.